Good afternoon. I'm delighted and honored to chair this keynote lecture, which, besides being one of the high points of our conference on modernity and its wake, will also be included in the Close Relations series, the Setups lectures on literature, culture, theater, and translation. The overall purpose of this lecture series is to prompt well-known scholars in the humanities to interrogate strands in Western imaginative production from early modernity to post-modernity. And this purpose will be marvelously served today by our guest speaker, Declan Kuypert. Declan Kuypert is Professor of Irish Studies and of English and Irish Language and Literature Emeritus, University of Notre Dame. Declan is a leading international authority on the literature of Ireland. He has authored scores of articles in many books, including Sing and the Irish Language, still from the late 1970s, Man and Feminism in Modern Literature, Inventing Ireland, Irish Classics, The Irish Writer and the World, a great number of titles that many in our audience will be familiar with. He has recently been working also on Beckett, and so I'm told, and I believe it's not out yet, on a shorter book about cricket to be entitled, or already entitled, England and Eternity. Declan has lectured in some 30 countries worldwide and contributed essays and reviews to the Irish Times, the Times Literary Supplement, the London Review of Books, the New York Times. Declan, in the context of what I know is a complicated moment involving a health emergency and hence the inability to travel, my colleagues and I are deeply grateful for your willingness to join us on this video link and for the great generosity that allows us to have you with us today. The virtual floor is yours, and thank you again very much.
Thank you, Rui. And truth to tell, it is you who have been generous to me in your kindness and practicality in making this form of the lecture possible. And I must say hello to my friends in Porto. This is the 40th anniversary of my visit. I went in '82 on the centenary of Joyce's birth, and I was so looking forward to revisiting your lovely city, but maybe that can be done perhaps in holiday mode sometime soon. If I'm a bit woozy or if some of my transitions are not completely clear, do tell me. I'm on some painkillers which are not completely conducive to clarity of mind, but at least they make functioning possible. My intention today was to talk about the status of the question in the history of modernism, and in particular about the fact that so many questions seem capricious and arbitrary. They come often at the end of a work of art, or else when they come earlier on, they come without an adequate foreground. They seem somehow floating free. When Gertrude Stein was experiencing one of her sicknesses, she tossed and turned on the bed, and she said famously, "What is the answer? What is the answer?" And when neither God nor her next of kin replied, she turned towards the wall and said, "Well then, would someone tell me what is the bloody question?" I think the status of the question is central to modernism. And, I think of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. And of course, Eliot sometimes gives tentative answers. What have we given? The awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. So it's a kind of case of impulse first, analysis afterwards. And I think this is one of the reasons why modernism became so timely at the moments when English departments were being set up across the world to engage in the post-match analysis of these texts. Eliot also is responsible for that wonderful critical statement that poetry, great poetry, has the power to communicate before it's understood. And again, I think that's a case of impulse first, analysis afterwards. And I want to show how true that is of some of our own leading Irish writers, and indeed of the political modernists who made the Easter Rising possible. That question and the status of it is very important, of course, to Joyce. He was a student at Belvedere College in Dublin, and he was the best at catechism in his class. You will know, of course, that the catechism was a manual of question and answer intended to teach students the basic elements of Catholic doctrine. And the authors tried to anticipate the hardest questions which could be put and equip the faithful forearmed with crisp answers. But the catechism was in some ways preposterous, because at the heart of religion is a mystery, a relationship with the divine, with the numinous. And yet the language of the catechism was extraordinarily precise and scientific. There never can be a single answer to any question worth asking. Knowledge, as Emerson said, is knowing that we cannot know. So the question and answer format is a little bit suspect. It's almost veering towards the scientific in Joyce's mind, or indeed towards what you might call interrogation. Questions that are asked only because the right answer is already known and must be given, irrespective of what the interrogated person believes. And there is a novel about life under the Nazi tyranny by Danilo Kish called Hourglass, which is in its structure modeled on Joyce's Ithaca, the penultimate chapter of Ulysses. And it shows how the ideological mufflers worn by the interrogators prevented their hearing anything other than what they wanted to hear. I think ideally, I suppose, a catechism should be terse and graphic, but this one in Joyce's book isn't. The narrative keeps tripping over itself with Bloom's desire to spell things out. And so the answers get longer, more tedious, more rambling. At the start of the chapter, exactitude is promised, as in any traditional Irish catechism, but by the end, the speaker is wandering all over the place, and Bloom constantly resorts to words like probably, maybe, perhaps, but. Ulysses is trying to be open to the idea of entelechy, but there's always new forms of knowledge designed to emerge, which, despite that inevitability, will take us by surprise. Ousted possibilities can never be fully lost, but they are shot through with utopian potentials. And current systems of knowledge may soon be dismantled as new orders emerge in which opposites could be dissolved. I think that Joyce's thinking was very close to that of Ernest Bloch, who talked about the utopian surplus in many works of art. And that is why that Ithaca chapter ends with so many questions, last of all the word where. And some people even believe that what is presented as a large dot may have actually been intended by Joyce in the text as a question mark. It was, of course, quite different for Yeats. His poems tend to end on a question. What then, sang Plato's ghost, what then? Oh, what of that? Oh, what of that? What is there left to say? Was there another Troy for her to burn? Did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? And most famous of all, at the end of Amongst School Children. And I think the question there, and it may be Yeats's greatest poem, the question there is asked in terrified uncertainty. We're dealing with a poem, as so often in Yeats, where the human heart is broken by the worship of images, chronicling the tragedy of suffering in the crucified Jesus, a man who trusted flesh enough to take bodily form. And the lover, the mother, and the nun worship an ideal rather than a real image, and the ideal breaks hearts. And I think that's the meaning of the final stanza. Labor is blossoming or dancing where the body is not bruised to pleasure soul, nor beauty born out of its own despair, nor blear-eyed wisdom out of midnight oil. The body is bruised by nuns who deny it in search of a beautiful soul, by lovers in the pangs of lovemaking for childbirth, And the wisdom of the poet himself is only purchased at the cost of bleary eyes. So even art, the ultimate worship of images, is included in the tragic picture, the wasted son of 60 years. Most critics, though, see the concluding image of the stanza as the resolution of these conflicts, when the poet turns from the world of these rotting bodies to the durable beauty of art captured in the dance. O body swayed to music, O brightening glance, how can we know the dancer from the dance? Which is to say, they see the question as rhetorical, not so much a serious question as a smart way of making a statement about the identity of the artist and the pattern created. But a close inspection has shown us that the status of art is already thrown into question by the poet's bleary eyes. And I think there are no rhetorical questions in the major poems of Yeats. If by a rhetorical question you mean an alternative way of making a statement. The dancer is the ideal image, probably of a woman brought to the marriage bed by a man who goes on to find a real image there, as indeed happened to Yeats. Freud used to joke that there were 4 people in every bed, the 2 actual persons lying therein, and also the idealized image each had of the other. With the result, he said, that the bed could sometimes seem a very crowded place. Eventually, a beautiful child is born out of the lover's search for a moment of ecstasy. But it's Yeats's belief that that fusion is never fully achieved. And he explained in another context, we beget and bear children because of the incompleteness of our love. I once asked the poet's son, Michael, about the meaning of that line. And Michael laughed and said, oh, I know what it means. When I was a little boy of 2, halfway down the stairs, my father tripped over me and he said, how the hell did you ever get here? Yeats insists always there is a real dancer taking knocks and bruises. Suffering has affected my poems no more than the character of the dancer affects the movements of the dance. But there's in that an admission that the suffering leaves its mark. When all the story's finished, what's the news? In luck or out, the toil has left its mark. And this is exactly what T.S. Eliot said, that an artist suffers in creating, but never allows that suffering to show through in the work of art directly. There must always be, Eliot says, a necessary distinction between the man who suffers and the mind which creates, because otherwise art would just be a version of self-pity. So Yeats's line, rehearsed with difficulty, lasts only for seconds and has to seem a moment's thought. A line may take us hours, maybe, but if it does not seem a moment's thought, our stitching and unstitching hath been naught. Sprezzatura, careless ease. But here, I think, he really wants you to believe that this question at the end is asked in terrified uncertainty. The poet's heart is broken by the ideal beauty of the dance, which reminds him as a fellow artist that the beauty is attained only at great cost and only for a few seconds. And I think it's amazing how many critics who are tough-minded about life become sentimental about art and insist that the dancer does become forever the pattern that is created. Of course, if we're thinking in terms of questions, perhaps the most relevant of all Yeats's poems is his great comment on the 1916 rebellion, Easter 1916. And in that, I find a series of questions, none of which is answered. And actually, that's rather like the technique adopted by Eliot in Prufrock. The last stanza of Easter 1916 revolves around 4 questions. And I'll go through the stanza in explicating the questions. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. Our part to murmur name upon name as a mother names her child, when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, no, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excessive love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse, MacDonagh and MacBride, Connolly and Pearce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. That final refrain had been suppressed at the end of the third stanza because Yeats was no longer sure that he had anything to celebrate. The poem is a love poem to Maud, his muse, and he wanted her to notice the hens calling to the moorcocks and the vibrancy of natural life, and to recall her from the stone of, impervious worship of an ideal to the flashing joys of the everyday. Maud wrote him a very funny and intelligent letter back saying that he didn't understand his own image of the stone. Yes, the rebels were like stones in their intense devotion to an ideal, but like the stones, by not changing, they changed everything. The stone makes the ripples in the river possible by its very fixity. And she thereby threw the poem back at Yeats and said to him it wasn't really adequate to the great occasion. So this is another of his dismal attempts at what my mother referred to as decades of foreplay in that long relationship. But the last stanza is interesting because in it, what the bard of Gaeldom is supposed to do, name the warrior dead, is finally done. He has been postponing that moment. This man kept a school, that woman. He didn't name them in the earlier stanzas, but now he must, in the end, reluctantly do so, having measured the human cost of their sacrifice. But the point to which I'd like to draw your attention is that each question is not answered, but suppressed by another. And this reminds me of a moment in, I think it was the BBC, where Yeats was once asked, is it true that an Irish person cannot answer a question without asking another? And Yeats said, who told you that? Who told you that? In Ireland, the status of the question is often ambiguous. We know Lloyd George's complaint that whenever the English seemed close to solving the Irish question, the Irish people had a disarming and frustrating habit of changing it. So here, when may it suffice? The first question of the four is immediately suppressed. That is heaven's part, our part to murmur name upon name. He goes back to his bardic duty of naming. What is it but nightfall? No, no, not night. The triple negative showing how much forcing is needed to suppress the question. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know the dream enough to know they had dreamed and are dead. He can't entertain any of these questions. And the last question is the most painful and rending of all. What if excessive love bewildered them till they died? And this is where I think the poem is not just a great work of political analysis, but also deeply autobiographical. Pearse had said, the leader of the Easter Rising, if I die, it will be from the excess of love I bear the gale. But Yeats is asking something more personal. What if excessive love bewildered me till I died? This is one of his last gasp attempts to win the hand of Maud Gonne. And the question is doubly painful for it. And the poem is a brilliant example of the occasional poem, whereby, as Stephen Spender said, public events were invading the personal lives of so many of the modernist artists that whenever they wrote something personal, it always turned out also to be political. So Yeats writes it out in a verse, MacDonald, MacBride, and Connolly and Pearse, now and in time to be wherever green is worn. And there's something kind of perfunctory about now and in time to be wherever green is worn, as if the lines are fillers. And when the refrain comes back, having been suppressed in the third stanza, a terrible beauty is born, it's somewhat shamefaced and apologetic. It's Maud Gonne's response. She said tragic dignity had returned to Ireland, and it combines Aristotle's ideas of pity and terror, creating a catharsis and changing the world of comedy. Early in the poem, the men who came with vivid faces and were simply the butt of ascendancy jokes and wore motley, changing them from clowns to characters who have entered the tragic gravity of history at the end and are therefore worthy to be named. But as I say, the poem is a prolonged postponement of that bardic duty to name. When you name something, you show your power over it. If you are hesitant about naming it, you're showing its power over you. And I think Yeats, who was, of course, away from Dublin when the Rising happened, he was dining with the Society Duchess in England, is trying desperately and retroactively to insert himself into the event and asked very painful questions about its meaning. Now, it seems to me that the Rising itself, as much as any of these literary works that surround it, was an act of modernism. Not many people knew what was happening in Easter week 1916. The soldiers who were sent over from Britain thought they might be in Belgium and had to ask passers-by. And the ordinary men in the ranks of the rebellion, including some of my own Keegan ancestors, didn't really know what was happening either. Confusion reigned. The Rising was led by, as Yeats showed, poets, playwrights, intellectuals, people like MacDonagh, Pearse, and so on, who understood that great events are at the mercy of the immediate moment. The rebellion was a total surprise, I think, to the authorities, but perhaps also to many of the men caught up in it. The senior administrators were all back in England, and the lower level ones were at the races at Fairyhouse. And the sentries posted on public buildings mostly had no ammunition. So it's almost as if the British forces are willing the natives to rebel. Yeats makes much of the Easter symbolism of renewal, redemption, new life. But there was a very practical reason for having the Rising at Easter, because, as I say, the defenses weren't manned. And the Chief Secretary, a very decent man called Augustin Birrell, Chief Secretary for Ireland on behalf of the English, admitted that he was caught off guard and wrote later in a memoir that the plays of Yeats and Synge had become to me of far more significance than the monthly reports of the Royal Irish Constabulary. He liked and cared for the Irish too much. That was his problem. And Shakespeare was in the air that week. The Irish Times had intended publishing a supplement to celebrate the Bard's tercentenary. Now it brought out an emergency edition in which it urged citizens to stay calm. How many citizens of Dublin have any real knowledge of the works of Shakespeare? Could any better reason for reading them be afforded than the coincidence of enforced domesticity with the poet's tercentenary? Now, that advice was not as clever as it sounded, because for at least 2 decades previously, Irish writers had been Celticizing Shakespeare, interpreting his plays as accounts of how they had been dispossessed of their true inheritance. When you look at the way in which someone like Yeats or Joyce read Shakespeare, it is very much usually an account of a struggle between a boring administrative competence and a doomed poetic complexity, whether the play is Richard II or whether indeed it's Hamlet. I think Hamlet's struggle with Claudius was an example of God's anointed being displaced by a usurper. And Yeats would write a cycle of epic plays devoted to Cuchulainn, in which the clash between the hero Cuchulainn and King Conqueror is the clash between a wise man who was blind from very wisdom and an empty man who thrust him from his place. So Imperial England's worship of success, which was the way in which some critics like Dowden read Shakespeare, led only to the wearing of hollow crowns. King Henry, triumphant over the poetic Richard, represents only the failure of triumph. Richard, however, the triumph of failure. Whoever loses life saves it. And that phrase, the triumph of failure, would become the title of a biography, the most famous biography of Patrick Pearse, leader of the Rising, because he told his followers their apparent collapse would lead to ultimate success. That would also in time become the major aesthetic principle of Samuel Beckett, who would say that to be an artist is to fail, but as no other dare fail. Although a lot of plays and artworks seem to have anticipated the Rising, I think, as I say, the event was an amazement to those caught up in it. Oscar Wilde had said the first duty in life is to adopt a pose, and what the second is, nobody has yet found out. There was an element of play acting in the rebellion. A lot of the leaders in the post office acted like literally actors. One wore a kilt, another Celtic rings, a third played the bagpipes in the lull between firing. And Yeats celebrates this theatricality in his poem. Early notices of the proclamation put up on city walls looked more like theatre advertisements. And the street and the stage were very close in those days. One of my great uncles, Edward Keegan, was in fact an Abbey actor shot through the lung in the South Dublin Union in the Rising, and fired indeed by the Irish Times for his disloyalism in that context. But the street and stage remained so close that when O'Casey put on The Shadow of a Gunman, a program note had to tell patrons that if they heard shots, these were not from the street, but from the stage. So I think in a way, what Yeats is suggesting in his poem is that the Rising was an early example of modernism in the streets. And this is how Iris Murdoch, in her great novel, The Red and the Green, depicted it, with the rebels as existentialists avant la lettre, who tried to become authentic to themselves. In some ways, the Rising anticipates the youth movements of the 1960s. Mysticism crossed with political radicalism, anti-imperialism with anti-empiricism. And three of the signatories of the proclamation were mystic poets, Pearse, MacDonagh, and Plunkett. MacDonagh, who was a lecturer in English, said that the mystic tries to express the things of God that are made known to him in no language. In other words, the rebels sought a dream of which they couldn't speak. They could only speak of having sought it. And that is why I think politicians in England became exhausted at the way the Irish seemed to change the question, because the Irish were looking for something deeper than an answer to the question. They were looking for a meaning to it. And I think Joyce shared in that search. Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man talks about the uncreated conscience of the race. And this is rather like Pearse asking, what if the dream comes true and millions unborn shall dwell in the house that I shaped in my heart, the noble house of my thought? I think the role of the unconscious in the thinking of these Irish modernists is crucial. And it contains, as Ernest Bloch said once, an imaginative surplus revealed only in the future. And you find that idea in Hamlet, a play which was staged during Easter week and which the rebels knew and understood very well. Orderly, says the player king, orderly to end where I begun, our wills and fates do so contrary run, that our devices still are overthrown, our thoughts are ours, their ends none of our own, that the deed often subverts the intended outcome, bringing people to a place they had never expected to be. If people had known their destination to begin with, they wouldn't have needed to go there. I'm always reminded of this when a student asks to write an application for a grant for a 3-year project, and you come to that dreadful box labeled outcomes. How could anyone know what the outcome would be if they didn't have the 3 years in which to unveil it? And this is the paradox which lies behind rebellions from subject peoples. You need a self in order to narrate a story, but how can you ever presume to know that self until the story is finally told and done? And that problem of how to represent the vision of the Easter rebels was, first of all, a problem for the insurgents themselves. If you look at the fuzzy print font of the proclamation, it captures it, how to present the unknown in the shop soiled language of the known. O'Casey eventually solved that problem by mostly keeping his rebels off stage. As a colleague of mine once wrote, his gunmen are usually shadows. Yeats, being more radical, asked in his play The Resurrection What if there is always something that lies outside knowledge, outside order? What if at that moment when knowledge and order seem complete, that something returns? There are, as I've been hinting therefore, no answers to any question worth asking. And in a way, that formulation is probably the best explanation of the Easter Rebellion that we're likely to get. It really wasn't in the economic interests of lecturers like MacDonagh or the son of Count Plunkett, Dublin into, but they'd obviously grown tired of the prevailing paradigm of parliamentary nationalism. And they weren't the only ones who got tired. Joyce wrote a devastating column in Il Piccolo della Sera, painting a devastating picture of the bankrupt Irish Nationalist Party, which had sold out at Westminster without extracting the usual 30 pieces of silver. And he wrote Ulysses out of the fear that his country would disappear. Exactly the same fear which actuated Pearse and his comrades to go into the post office, that something had to be done to prevent the loss of the very idea of Ireland in World War I. And the rebels did agonize about their action, because there is an element of original sin about their founding act. A sovereign people derive from it, and yet what was done can look like terrorism, or at least impulsive action, insufficiently motivated. What Eliot said about Hamlet, emotion in excess of the facts as they appear. The Rising blew away the world of parliamentary bourgeois nationalism, which was being mocked by Joyce at the same moment in Ulysses. And like Joyce, the rebels left the people of Ireland in later decades with a daunting problem. How do you catch up with that modernity? As Ellman challenged at the end of his great biography, we must still learn how to be Joyce's contemporaries. Like Joyce's masterpiece, The Rising was an answer, but it was an answer to a question that nobody had really asked. As in classical tragedy, the unaskable question once put shatters all paradigms of the inherited world. And I think this is why Joyce used the Odyssey. Eliot, I think, was wrong when he said that he turned to Homer for an image of order to impose on the chaos of modernity. I think it's exactly the reverse. Odysseus had traveled beyond the known world and brought back a disturbing new knowledge which required the re-paradigming of all existing knowledge. And that's why Joyce chose Odysseus rather than the Iliad, because the Odyssey was the traveling book, the ultimate book of modernism. For years, the Irish, like Hamlet, had lost the power of action in the energy of resolve. That is the period of cultural soul searching which so bedazzled Augustin Birrell and gave us the Irish cultural revival. Now, some of them wanted to praise rashness, the fact that in order to act, you have to forget so many things of what you know, because otherwise scruple will smother all possibilities. And this is based on the idea of progress, which is revolutionary rather than gradualist. You know, a Joyce or a Pearse has a flash of intuition, breaching all models, but it can take hack work, years of hack work, before the vision becomes viable. And that is why Yeats says, after the Rising, everything changed utterly. All the prior bases for a knowledge of Ireland had to be reconfigured. Of course, a moment eventually comes when the Free State or a book like Ulysses no longer seems remarkable. It becomes instead an almost banal environment, so that by the 50th anniversary, the Rising seemed to have been domesticated and lost its power to disturb. Yeats understood these ambiguities, I think, better than anyone else. He knew that every dream involves responsibilities. It makes a claim on the future as well as the past. Even the plotters in Shakespeare don't allow themselves to enunciate a plan until it's already half achieved. And yet its bloody consequences may not be fully foreknown. So in the world of the insurrectionist, as in the world of T.S. Eliot, expression precedes conceptualization. The meaning is only attributed afterwards. The revolt in the colony is a kind of patricide. Nietzsche said, if you don't have a good father, you must go and invent a better one, father yourself. This is like Jay Gatsby, Fitzgerald's figure springing from some Platonic conception of himself. It is in some ways like Eliot's notion of tradition, that all previous writers are to be reinvented and reassigned in a new order that makes the present more viable. It's like what Jean-Paul Sartre meant when he said in words, I always preferred to derive only from myself, having no father. If your history is a nightmare, you need to invent a better version of the past, more answerable to current needs. So, for instance, Pearse assured people that the kind of liberal Montessori type school he wished for would be simply a return to medieval Gaelic monastic schools. And James Connolly said that socialism would be a return to the old Gaelic system of communal landholding, except now the state rather than the chief would do the holding. In order to secure a hearing in a conservative country, these figures presented something radical as a return to the past. And this is what Joyce, of course, did, casting Ulysses as a reworking of one of Europe's oldest tales. I think it was because they were all disrupting chronology that they felt the need to invoke tradition. Men make the world, Marx said, but not in conditions of their own choosing. So the rebellion is not just against authority, but against conditions. And in these circumstances, Marx said, they conjure up ghosts from the past, as Hamlet conjured the ghost of his father, and as the French revolutionaries resurrected the ancient Romans. The immensity of the new thing seemed unutterable, most of all to those who wished to utter it. But like Hamlet, they had within that passage show. They were impulse-ridden. They wanted to give voice to a desire so buried as to be scarcely conscious of itself as such. And this is a moment when I think we should point out that the role of boredom in these histories can never be underestimated. You can give lots of causes of World War I, militarism, blood sacrifices, food prices in cities. You can even add, in the case of Ireland, the frustration of a postponed home rule. But I think many young men joined armies in that period because they were bored and because they were looking for extreme sensations, as Sartre would say. Ultimately, they contemplated a future exciting to the extent that it was unknown. And again, Yeats is the one who captures the meaning of that with astonishing clarity. He defines genius as a crisis which suddenly links our buried self to our trivial daily mind. Only later do these intuitions of intrepid souls become clear to the wider community. And the only way to be original was to go back to origins. The Irish knew from the classic texts they quoted, from Homer to Shakespeare, that they had an intellectual surplus and that they indicated the contours of the future. Like all visionaries, they emitted the light through which they became visible, and they created thinking according to which their actions would be comprehensible. And then a point comes where they seem less and less original and they lose their high definition. And subsequent events give what happened a look of inevitability. The tale of Hamlet, as Joyce retold it in Ulysses, concerned the unpredictable ways in which interior monologue, which he called the unconscious, could be excavated and mapped onto the everyday mind. The script of a life, like the task of a generation, is never completely self-assigned. Sometimes the usurped son, after a period of soul-searching, will learn how to act on instinct and ask the questions later. But Shakespeare shows there's no guarantee of being understood even by kindred spirits. And you have that terrible irony of Horatio at the end, burying Hamlet in military uniform, bury Hamlet like a soldier to his grave, in defiance of his other identities as courtier, soldier, poet, playwright, celebrated indeed by the dead Ophelia. It reminds me of the moment I went to the museum with my father here in Dublin when I was 9 and saw Pearse and his comrades depicted solely in military vestiture. This is what happened to Pearse at the hands of his hagiographers, as well as of later fault finders, his rich writings on literature and education forgotten. I suppose we people going into those museums in our risk-averse bureaucratic lives felt rather sheepishly that we'd never measure up to the extraordinary exaltation of that 1916 generation. And I think there has always been a similar embarrassment in England about the sacrifices made in World War I, and even a covert resentment in later times against that charismatic generation, which sucked up so much oxygen from the past as well as the future. At the end of his poem, Yeats is using those filler lines with a kind of wearied sense that he knows this event will become banalized, and even his own poem with it, and people will extract the refrain, which in fact he has done so much to throw into question. So that the mediocrity complained of by returned English soldiers in the 1920s and 30s, that had its equivalent feeling among the post-revolutionary generation in Ireland. The rebel poets of 1916 have been depicted sometimes as artistes manqués, who, on failing to achieve true fulfillment in the first rank of art, were tempted by the alternative, the fatal lure of action. And equally, figures like Yeats and O'Casey, who had been registered in insurrectionary movements, Yeats was in the IRB, must have felt a pang at their non-involvement when so many associates were putting their lives on the line. As I say, Yeats was caught out at a society event in England when the Rising actually broke out. But I think it would be wrong to treat the artists as frustrated rebels and the rebels as frustrated artists. The artists complete the event, and some of the rebels were thinkers of amazing power. And what they produced, I believe, is a case of modernism in the streets. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Declan, for this fascinating and broad-ranging lecture on so many of the perplexities posed by this very challenging and stimulating period in our cultural and literary histories. I think I may have to do something with the screen before I come here. Just a moment. Yeah, that's more like it. Now, we've got some time for questions. Is that okay with you, Declan?
Of course.
All right. There's a roving microphone or potentially roving microphone. Questions? Anyone? Well, I could start with one. I mean, you were, and in fact, you resumed that that phrasing right at the end. If my notes are correct, at a certain point, you were referring to the manner in which Yeats was troping the Rising in Easter 1916 as a matter of modernism on the streets. The sentence that you were now employing again towards the end of your lecture. I suppose my question would be, would that be that reading of Easter 1916 a way of confirming that aspiration of Yeats's to be able to address a chosen audience of a few, considering the reduced rationality of the rebellion, or on the contrary, a way of overcoming that sense of addressing a small chosen audience of initiates, considering that it meant relaying prospect into action?
That's a very interesting question and a very good way of putting it. Lady Gregory said about the art of the Abbey Theatre, and Yeats's plays were, of course, very Mandarin, very much for the audience of the few. She said, we went on giving what was good until eventually it became popular. Now, I suppose no one could ever say that all the plays of Yeats became popular, but I think Pearse's notion that we are just a few hundred men and we are going out to lose and be slaughtered, but in the end we will win. We will take the popular majority with us. I think there is a kind of similarity in the aspirations of both the artistic and, if you want, the political movement. Think of Yeats's poem, The Fisherman. All day I'd looked in the face of what I'd hoped would be to write from my own race and the reality. And the reality is, of course, the rejection of the play by his great friend J.M. Synge. But he did want to write for his own race. And he did feel envy when he walked past the field in Connacht and heard men who were saving the hay singing songs from Love Songs of Connacht by Douglas Hyde. Yeats always did dream of that kind of representative status, which in some ways he achieved in the latter years of his life when his ballads were published in the Irish Press, which was De Valera's newspaper and regarded as a very radical new paper. Yeats, who tended to support Fine Gael rather than Fianna Fáil, the other party, was delighted that his ballad of Roger Casement appeared in the Irish Press. So yeah, I think there's a sort of paradox that Yeats appears, like many other modernists, to have a very refined and even, anti-mass kind of prejudice. But the deeper, perhaps unconscious impulse is to connect with the multitude. All this connects, of course, with the distrust of literacy, of the wide availability of newsprint peddling somewhat glib forms of writing. And you can see modernism as an attempt to challenge all that and produce a much more demanding and versatile kind of reader.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Other questions? Well, I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but I've got another one. Yeah, Adriana. We've got a question from Adriana, and then I'll ask mine if there's time. Go ahead.
Thank you for your lecture. It was lovely to listen to you and to read you. Now, the role of boredom can never be underestimated. I did write down that sentence. I'm really very interested in boredom and in the relationship between boredom and excitement. Being an academic, it's natural, this interest. No, and the interesting, one of the interesting features in your lecture was the parallel that you underscored between what was happening in the Rising and what was being written. And my question perhaps would be about the role of history as adventure, because if you are bored, you're looking for adventure, and the role that this idea of history as adventure plays in the many texts which were written about the rebellion. Thank you.
Yes, well, it is a very paradoxical, almost bipolar situation, that young men in the long peace became bored and fell for the blandishments of an officer class who lured them into a bloody war. I mean, that would be the general reading, I suppose, of World War I now. We Irish would, of course, say that, at least in our case, our leaders were taking the men who followed them to somewhere more intelligible, ultimately an independent republic. And the volunteers in the Irish Rebellion Army were not paid. Those Irish who went to fight in the British Army were paid. And that is why the word volunteer is so important in the vocabulary of Irish writing. But I do think that probably a great number of these young men were bored by the long peace. There's actually an interesting essay by Freud in which he says that people had become supine during the long peace. And then he adds, and it's a rather horrible sentence, life has become interesting again when 10,000 men die in an hour of the repeating gum. Life has recovered its full content. This is actually very close to what Patrick Pearse is supposed to have said, that the earth needed to be filled with the red wine of the battlefields. And we find that kind of rhetoric rather creepy. O'Casey put Pearse's speech on the stage to mock it and to say that no sensible man would ever want that kind of bloodletting. But Freud, the great humanist, had actually come out with a very similar line. So yes, I think there is a sense in which at certain moments, the search for extreme sensations becomes pervasive. Now, I should add a rider to that in the Irish case. Most of the Irish opposed conscription into World War I when it was finally threatened in 1918. And in fact, the reason Sinn Féin became a strong party was because it opposed conscription. People link Sinn Féin to violent insurrectionism, but it has always done much better when it was a pacific, peace-loving party. And I think in some ways, the Irish had had too much of the extreme situations in the 19th century, you know, not just the terrible famine, but constant military suppressions. So in Joyce, something as banal as drinking a cup of tea becomes a revolutionary act, not going into battle like Prince Andrei. Prince Andrei gets an interior monologue as he goes into battle in Tolstoy, but Mr. Bloom gets an interior monologue when he's doing nothing more revolutionary than drinking a cup of tea. The everyday becomes the preserve of the insurrectionary artist, Joyce, who knows that we've had perhaps too much bloodletting. So there's a tremendous ambiguity in the Irish attitude. There is a small cadre of people who want their own equivalent of the official violence enacted by the British Army, but there are probably many more who believe, like Joyce did, that the ordinary is the proper domain of the artist and the extraordinary can be left to militarists and journalists.
All right, thank you. Is there one final question? Well, I had one, but I mean, it's something, I suppose, well, relatively, well, not simple in its implications, but a bit of a footnote. At a certain moment, Declan, you were commenting on the old joke about Irish people supposedly not knowing how to answer a question without asking another one. I suppose a basis for that, but I'm assuming that, would be also that perception that the underlying ancestral language supposedly wouldn't provide you with the possibility of just answering yes or no. Maybe that would be, you know, a part of the issue. But my question, I suppose, would be this perception. Do you think it may have started as a sort of demeaning stereotype, or you ask them a question, instead of answering, they respond with another question? But in an age that has made aporia and a skepticism of, you know, of straight answers to straight questions so central to our understanding of who we are, do you think that what began as a possible demeaning stereotype may have become a cultural asset?
Yes, I do. And I think that the 4 questions at the end of Easter 1916, the 8th poem, are questions of increasing intensity, increasing intelligence, that he is articulating actually what many Irish people would have been asking at that time. And he knows the questions to some degree even contradict each other. In other ways, they are a development of one another. And they do not allow for a finally settled position. So aporia is a very, very good word. And I think you'd find the same in the monologues of Beckett. And for similar reasons, I drew the perhaps surprising analogy between Beckett and Pearse, both of them believers in the triumph and the rhetoric of failure. But I think, yeah, a lot of the questions in Beckett come just like the questions in Pearse and Joyce. And you are right, there is no word in the Irish language either for yes or no. I often think of that when I used to see Reverend Paisley, the leader of militant loyalism in the North, saying Ulster says no. And I used to think, well, can you put Irish on that, Reverend Ian? You couldn't. And I think the lack of yes and no is a means by which, as Beckett once said, Irish people circumnavigate their dread of direct verbal commitments. They don't, I mean, we have a great literature partly because we can't give a simple, straight answer to a question.
Well, thank you again, Declan. Before we bring this session to a close and release our guest speaker by, again, joining our hands, I notice that His Excellency Ralph Victory, Ambassador of Ireland, has already joined us. He is a kind sponsor of this event. Ambassador Victory, would you like to join me here at the lectern and address us just for a few moments, precisely, during this period in which we still have our guest speaker for this afternoon with us? Would you please come down?
Good afternoon, Roy. I can scarcely give a yes or no answer after the last contribution for Professor Kiberd. Thank you very much, Roy. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very sorry that I'm only just arriving and catching the very tail end of your contribution, Professor Kiberd. And I understand from Roy that you had some recent mishap and unfortunately unable to be here in person, but it's delightful to see you at least on the screen, and thank you very much indeed for your contribution today. So looking forward obviously to further sessions of the conference and to connecting with some familiar faces that I see and some new ones also as well. So I really have nothing to add at this stage. Obviously we will have maybe some other opportunities to discuss some of the themes of the conference, but Professor Kiberd, thank you so much indeed for your involvement in today's event, and very much appreciate it. And I'll definitely go and look up that quote from Beckett, and but decline to give a yes or no answer at this stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank the ambassador for his presence and to say how impressed I've been over the years by the way in which ambassadors from our embassies support cultural events. I know they have many other economic and political demands on their time, but I think it is very much in the spirit of the creators of the Irish Revival to see the connections between self-expression in art and indeed economic prosperity. That was something that the people who created our country believed passionately in, that we would have economic, political, and cultural freedom going hand in hand. So it's wonderful that yet again, one of our ambassadors is here. And when I first went to Porto in 1982, someone had come from the embassy, and I cannot tell you how impressed I was. I know we shouldn't be boasting too much in a chauvinistic way about our own countries, but in a sense, I want to say thanks on behalf of the intellectuals and academics to our diplomatic service for how well they have connected us with the outside world.
Well, on this note, on this very positive note, we'll then sign off. Again, Declan, thank you very much for such a fascinating contribution to our program, and all the best health-wise as well.
Thank you, and very good luck to everyone at the conference. And I wish you success, and in the name of the ambassador, victory. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.